to Connect to Pods, commercial services group recruitment podcast for job seekers and employees alike. Welcome to the first episode of our Connecting to People series. We thought it'd be great to have an interview that followed the timeline of someone who has just started looking for a job all the way to getting an interview for a job they've been hoping for. Today, we're talking with Stephen Hoban. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello all, my name is Stephen Hoban. I'm Services Director for Commercial Services Group, where I operationally oversee our managed service and joint venture initiatives and our externally facing trading brands.
This is our full and uncut interview of Stephen Hoban. So if you'd like to listen to each section in individual chunks, then look for episodes 3.1 to 3.4. The first step of anyone's journey would begin with networking. So Stephen, without further ado, a simple question with a not so simple answer. Why should you network?
Yes, it's a really good point, Joe. I think it is an area that a lot of people don't take as seriously as they should in terms of their ongoing career progression. I think it's widely recognised that people who network efficiently and very much proactively engage with their network do tend to progress better through their careers. I think it was statistically broken down by a business professional and is widely kind of used in seminars, etc. That about 10% of your progression is down to being competent and good at what you do. About 30% is down to your professional brand and how you're perceived by others, and the remaining 60 is down to networking and your ability to do so effectively. So I think it plays a very important role in your overall career and the life cycle of your career. But actually, I think there's many other reasons why being involved in networking activities is important. I think if you work in a very specialist skill area, it can allow you access to similarly minded individuals where you can share best practice or the latest intelligence in the market, and that can help, indirectly widen your skill set. And obviously the obvious one is, it widens the number of opportunities available to you if your network is extensive and actively engaged. So yeah, I think it is important. I think also it's important to recognise that it is a skill. Different people, I think, network to different levels naturally, but to really maximise the effective use of network, it does take time. It takes investment to not only make those appropriate connections in the first place, but to build those relationships and have an effective network. So it is a skill that you should treat as part of your job search, but overall your overall career planning is to invest the time and learn the skills to truly network effectively.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, 60%, that's a pretty significant stat to ignore. For many of our listeners that may be panicking hearing that, can you settle their nerves and say, when does networking truly begin? Are they too late?
Yeah, oddly enough, I've only recently been exposed to that stat myself, so I can empathise with everybody thinking, hold on, I've missed a huge chunk of how I could have been progressing my career. So I understand that, and I think the important thing is to recognise that there's, you haven't missed the boat. You can be right at the beginning of your career, you can be partway through, or, as I may be, kind of in a mature career position. But there's still many benefits to networking. So even if it's something that you think, oh, well, I didn't recognise that, it is something I need to work on, it's not too late. I think, when does it begin? Well, actually, it begins with every interaction you make, really. Well, maybe not every interaction, but certainly every business interaction. So it's kind of with every colleague that you come across, every customer you deal with, every potential client that you may or may have spoken to or developed a long-term relationship with, and even some prospective individuals that aren't in your network yet, but you can see through what they do on a daily basis, perhaps a role that's very similar to yours, or they are recognised experts in a particular area, or influencers, or whatever you would call it. So I think from the minute you understand that it's an important role, then that's the perfect time to start. It's not too disastrous to suddenly think, well, I've never really been involved in this, so now I'm going to have to replicate the last 20 years and make up for it. But it is an amazing statistic, and it did take me by surprise. But I think once you know that, you can look around probably in your own experience and see individuals that have progressed and think, well, I didn't really understand why they have maybe, got that job that I could have went for. But we do, whether it's a British thing, I don't know, but certainly there's a little bit of a hiding behind our own bushel. So we kind of believe that if we just go about doing our job diligently and do a very good job, then the career opportunities will come our way. And for some people that does happen, and for some really progressive organisations, they have things in place that recognise talent coming through their organisations and are very proactive in managing that. But actually, some places aren't, and sometimes, companies that perhaps aren't as progressive can not deliberately hold people in certain positions, but are they genuinely looking to progress someone who's highly competent in an area, particularly if they've got a skill set that is, going to be difficult to replace. So I think you do have to take ownership of your own career, even if it's right at the very start of it. That's not to say you have to have every stage mapped out, but, to know that you want to progress and to build that network around a network that might help create or support those opportunities, whether directly, as in, yes, this person's the hiring manager for a company I want to work for further down the line, or just this person is clearly an expert and well-renowned in their field. So, being connected to them and sharing content that they then like, for example, on social media, that adds a kind of credibility to yourself. So I think it's never too late, but it's a case of, recognize it as part of the puzzle and trying to, find the strategies to give it the time it deserves, I think.
Amazing. Thank you. So based on that answer, it sounds like there isn't really a good or a bad time or place to make a business connection. Whenever you find someone in the relevant sector or even just a similar position that you're after, make the connection and grow your network. But for those of us that may feel like they're falling behind and want to speed up a little bit with their networking, are there any places they can go to start creating their own network as quickly as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there are certainly, particularly now, more than ever, with things such as, the rise of things like webinars. In perhaps maybe 10 years ago, if I look at my career, it would have to be around attending, large conferences or seminars, a trip to London and a day out to try and maximise. It's very difficult for people to do that, particularly in less senior roles, because you can't really say to your hiring manager, I want to go to London because I potentially want to network with all these people. But the access to various groups, seminars, webinars, etc., that are now virtual and online really has widened that. And the amount of, I suppose, content, for want of a better word, that's available, whether it be on YouTube, TED Talks, individuals who, post. I'm not saying you necessarily link with everybody that looks great on YouTube, but what I'm kind of saying is the amount of content or the potential touch points of finding out who these people are is much wider than it was. But yes, on a more basic level, it might be as simple as finding small groups of like-minded individual business owners in a local area with a view to networking to drive greater sales generation opportunities. On a larger corporate level, it might be looking at individuals who have the same roles as you do in different organizations, and likewise through, if you look at LinkedIn, for example, there's a huge number of groups that you can follow, there's organizations you can follow, there's trade magazines that you can follow, and the ability to share articles yourself that you may have read either in a book or you may have picked up from the news or the press. If you think it's relevant to your network, then sharing things and being proactive in that network is now in many ways easier than ever. It still takes the work, but the the touch points that are open to you are significantly more through the rise of social media than perhaps they were 10, 20 years ago, when it would be, perhaps a bit more of a face-to-face, old school style way of networking.
Excellent. Thank you. So would you say that there are any important factors to consider when trying to create these business connections?
Yes, I think there is. I think that there needs to be, so first of all, there needs to be a kind of reason for the connection. Just suddenly deciding that you don't think your network is very large. So if I just take LinkedIn or Facebook as an example, to suddenly rush out and try and connect with everybody doesn't necessarily mean you will have a good network. I think the important thing is to focus on having a good network, not a large network. I think it's also important to be open and honest with people that you are engaging with. So, and also to do so on a reciprocal or mutual benefit arrangement. So you may not, for example, want to reach out to the chief exec of Google and say, I'd love to connect with you because at some point I want to get a job with your organization. I mean, that might actually work. I don't know. But, it's more likely, for example, that you may reach out to, say you're a procurement manager, you may reach out to various other procurement managers across your sector, whether that be something very specific like FMCG or recruitment or public sector, and say, I'm really keen to connect with like-minded individuals that work in the same space for the sharing of ideas and collaborating in the future. And, when someone then comes back and makes that connection with you, it's perhaps then about, taking that next stage. Can we find 5 or 10 minutes to catch up to see that where our interests might be congruent and where there's a space for us. And part of that is, I think this is my personal approach, but part of that is about understanding how you may be able to help them, because there's a lot of relationships and a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, for example, that I'm sure we all get, which is, I'd like to connect because I want to sell you something. Now that's a sales generation call. It's a kind of replacement from a cold call. Whereas if you're trying to create a relationship where it's, can I have some time to find out what sort of thing might be of interest to you, should I come across it, then that's builds a relationship based on reciprocity, which is often more effective in terms of creating a long-term relationship. Because if you can do something for somebody else, then human nature kind of dictates at some point they'll be more inclined to want to do something for you. And that something might be make another connection that might be even more relevant for you. It might be, giving some sort of credibility to content you share. It might be, might be as literal as making you aware of an opportunity that's coming up in their organization. But I think it's kind of important. I suppose the point I'm making is you want to build a network that's around much more than just who can I reach out to the next time I'm looking for a job. It's much more multifaceted than that. If you truly want it to be a really strong and open network.
Great. So if you build networks, you should find openings where there wouldn't have been any otherwise. A network contributes a significant amount to finding your dream job, so make sure you get started. Not every job can be attained through a network that you create, or sometimes your connection may like you but not know of your expertise and skills, so they may still ask for a CV. That being the case, to you, Stephen, what makes a good CV?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that even if the network came through and, it's more likely that it would generate an opportunity rather than, Stephen, we get on so well on LinkedIn, could you just come and work for my company next Tuesday? So it's more likely that it would connect you to an open vacancy or make you aware of some recruitment activity that an organisation was doing. But I would still expect that you would have to, go through a process of application via online and inevitably at some point, unless it's a very rare occasion, at some point, submitting a CV. So the question of what makes a good CV inevitably will come up, and this is a very tricky question in a few ways, in a sense that it's a really subjective concept, the CV, and in some ways a little bit potentially outdated, and I suspect over the next few years automation may diminish the role of a CV, but right now the CV is still the stock and trade of looking for work. So to answer what makes a good CV, there's some really basic stuff, I think. We have wonderful tools available to us now with IT, but I still think, in my experience, the best CVs aren't overcomplicated. They are concise, they are to the point, they aren't overly lengthy. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that anything longer than 2 pages is a travesty, but certainly if you're very experienced, you don't want to be putting together a 13-page CV. But I think the key thing, if there was one factor, what makes a good CV, then it is directly relevant to the role that you're applying for. And I think that is key. I think more and more as we've moved to, or as the role of the recruiter, the recruitment agency has risen, and I suppose more recently online direct application to organisations through some sort of portal or online application that doesn't involve speaking to a person, then the CV needs to be really honed to the actual vacancy. You can create a generic CV that I would call your starter for 10, if you like, and this may form the foundation of the later, more specific CVs that you apply to, and it may be perfectly adequate to start those first conversations with the agency that you're working for, or the agency that you want to apply for. But it's important to recognise that when you're dealing through an agency or when you're dealing through an online portal, that it is absolutely key to be as relevant for that job as possible. If you have, for example, a certain skill set that this job asks for, or the agency is required on their advert, if it is tucked away in page 4 of your CV, then the chances are, either through the time and attention that the recruiter will give it, or some sort of semi-automated algorithm, that it's unlikely your CV will be pulled out for that level of experience. So it's important to recognise, the same as a word search on Google, relies on certain algorithms to pull that web page to the top. The same happens with your CV. Most recruiters, I can't remember statistically what the industry says, but it's somewhere in the region of a recruiter's going to give you a CV somewhere in the region of 10, 11 seconds of their time. And if they're not, for want of a better word, hooked or engaged or bought in to read further, then there's every chance that you won't progress past that stage. And similarly, while some people may argue that an internal recruiter for an organisation will do a more thorough job, even if you take that 10, 11 seconds and make it 20 seconds, you're still only getting a little bit of someone's time to grab their attention. So to make a good CV, it needs to be tailor-made for the opportunity and specific to that opportunity. And that is a good CV, in my view, anyway.
Fantastic, thank you. So following that advice, people have got a great idea of what they should be focusing on to make a good CV, at least in your mind. But when it comes to making their first CV, the starter 10 CV, as you said, the more generic one, do you have any advice on where to start when building that CV?
There's many templates available if you just wanted to start. You've got a blank sheet of paper, you have no real idea how to start this. You either haven't needed one for the 20 years of your career, or you're just starting out and you really don't know where to start. And there's plenty of good templates available. But my key thing would be start with something simple. There's lots of templates out there that will have some sort of graphic overlay. They will either navigate everything down the left-hand side, they will navigate down the right, they will turn it almost into a PowerPoint, which, if you're applying for a role as a graphic designer and your potential audience wants to see creativity in work, absolutely they have their place. But for most people, standard employees, a CV that isn't going to cause somebody a huge amount of trouble in terms of opening through format or some bespoke software would be a must. So you can't really do much wrong with Word, standard Word document. I think also, let's not get too creative with fonts. It doesn't necessarily matter what fonts you choose, although I wouldn't, necessarily be over elaborate. The standard ones would probably, in my view, work best, but certainly you might only want one font in your Word. You might want to use italics and bold for highlighting certain areas. Well, stick with one font. Just to address size while we're on, there is a kind of mythology that 2 pages is the optimum CV. I think really for most people, other than people really starting their career, it's very difficult to encapsulate all your experience on 2 pages. I think probably I would start to get a little bit wary or concerned if I was getting past 4 pages. But I think certainly somewhere between 2 and 4 is a very comfortable space for a CV, particularly for someone who is, has been working for a number of years. So you start off really quite simply, really. So, you start off with name. I wouldn't necessarily have education as the next thing, but what I may choose to do is in the top of the CV, perhaps under the name, I may mention certain really specific qualifications. So, for example, if somebody was a qualified accountant, or you were applying for an engineering job and somebody had, the relevant engineering qualification, or likewise if you had maybe an MBA or something like that, but it would be really abbreviated in terms of initial only, perhaps under the name. Then you may or may not want to put on your contact details. You may just want to include your number and email. I'm not really sure at this stage putting your address on. It also helps protect your identity, your ID a little bit in terms of GDPR at that stage. But then I'm a big fan of a profile area, and I'll come back, and if you can remind me, Joe, to talk a little bit more about the profile, because I think it's an important tool. Then really you work through your experience from most recent backwards. If you are relatively new to the job market and say you have 10 years work experience, then you may want to put every job on there. Well, you would want to put every job anyway, but you may want to have a descriptor for the last 3 roles you've had that have taken you 10 years. If you find yourself, been employed for 25 or 30 years, then you may want to cover off the last 1 or 2 or the last 10 years work, depending on how many jobs are involved. And then after that, I think you can really you don't really need much more than just a job title and the dates of the duration of that work. I can't think off the top of my head. There may be some really specialist areas that, people will be interested in your very early career. But I think really if you've covered off your last 10 to 12 years, I think that's the experience that most employers are going to be looking at. And I think when you start to write down what it is you do, a good place to start is your job description. Of course, that's a nice little place to pull off some of the immediate tasks. But I think one thing that feeds into being specific is try to extend. Well, there's 2 things. So you're trying to be specific. So where you can be specific and quantifiable or qualifiable, I think that is really important. So an example I would say there is you can put, I manage a team. But there's a big difference between managing a team of 2 and managing a team of 55. So I would be specific. So you may want to say, I have extensive man management experience. I currently manage 5 direct reports and indirectly 42 staff across 3 divisions. That's a more complete answer. Likewise, you may be involved in a program or a project to save money. So then if you can go on to say, I implemented a new project to implement a new procurement system, and that procurement system saved us 11.5%, equating to £1.2 million. Again, more specific. So when I started my career, too long ago to mention, but one of the sales tools that we were taught as a recruiter was an idea of what's called features and benefits. And I often, while I think we've done it as a sales tool, I think it's always held its place while trying to put together a CV. So everything I write down, or what I encourage others to write down on their CV, I think features and benefits. So the features are what you did. So if I use the man management example again, the feature is I manage a team. The benefit is what are the specifics and what is the potential benefit to the organisation. Now, sometimes there won't be a benefit per se, and it will be a matter-of-fact statement, as in, I manage four direct reports and 45 indirect reports. But then there's other things that you might be able to extrapolate through to a benefit. So an example would be, I have extensive experience of managing and motivating teams. I manage a team of 5 people, 5 direct reports with 45 indirect reports. And over the last 2 years, I have increased performance of that team by 5%, and I've reduced staff turnover by 25%. So therefore, you're now giving whoever's viewing your CV, you're giving them a couple of things. You're giving them some real specifics that they can relate to their business, i.e., well, this job manages 2,000 people. So is this person potentially at the level I need? Likewise, well, this job only manages 1 part-time administrator. So again, we might not be on par. Likewise, if the job spec, for example, says one of the roles is to successfully lead and motivate teams, then by adding those additional bits of information, it really starts to bring that experience to life for the potential employer, who can, draw direct correlations between some of the things they're trying to achieve with this job, whether that be an improvement in staff retention, for example, and it just sort of allows them to, start to compare apples and apples rather than apples and an unknown. So I'm not sure I've got a little bit off track there, but I think that sort of, detail when you start to put together is important, rather than just perhaps write every little, thing that's on your job description. Then you think you work through, obviously you give a little bit less time to roles that are further on, and that's what will help keep, the length of the CV down. Then towards the end, obviously, I think it's really important to have those qualifications on there. So you'd have your education piece, and I think that's also a space that's, isn't just about your formal qualifications. I think it's really important to put other things on there that are qualifications, even if they're not relevant, even if they're not pure academic, for example. So if you've completed things like Prince 2, or if you've completed managing successful programs, or other more industry-specific qualifications or training courses. And then finally, and I mean, maybe I'm a little bit out of date here, but I do think the hobbies and interests area of a CV is still important. I think it adds, a little bit of humanity to what people do. It creates an area for common ground if you do, move towards interview, or certainly conversation with the agencies. Again, I would be very tempted not to go into War and Peace, and maybe, people aren't too interested in things that you've done when you were 14, like your swimming badges or whatever, but people are probably interested to know if you, are a black belt in a martial art, or if you've completed a Duke of Edinburgh award, or if you're an avid skydiver. I think these things are still important, so I would follow that through. So to go back to the profile area, so the profile area for me is key. So there's a couple of reasons. I think one is it really helps with the idea of being able to tailor make your CV. So the profile area is where you would write down all your experience, but the profile area is maybe a paragraph, a couple of short paragraphs, or maybe even a couple of specific bullet points where you can really address some of the key areas that the job description is looking for. Or if you're just making that initial approach to an agency, it's where you can really highlight some of your skills and experience. So it may start, for example, Stephen is an experienced manager with over 20 years experience in the recruitment industry. Key strengths and experience include, and then you might have managing teams of up to 50 people plus across 3 geographies or EMEA or whatever you want to put on there. Then you might have, extensive experience of driving sales performance. You might have extensive experience of managing large successful projects and programs, including projects in excess of 12 million, whatever those details may be. And it allows basically to go back to that 10, 11 seconds you've got to get somebody to go, I want to read on. And that's where, if it's the first interaction with an agency, and I'm happy to discuss how different agencies work, because you might pitch the CV slightly differently, but that first interaction, you're working to get the attention of an agency, there's no specific job, then really what it allows you to do is input 4 or 5 bullets, the key things that you think are what you are bringing to the market. If you're reacting to a job specifically from an agency, then you've got their job description. So, the key things they're asking for in the first 4 or 5 bullet points of their job description, that's really where you'd want to be illustrating straight away that you have that experience. Example being, say it's an in-house talent acquisition role, and they may turn around and say, must have experience of managing multiple talent acquisition professionals across Europe, Middle East and Africa. So if you've done that, then you would want your first bullet point to be extensive experience of managing talent acquisition teams globally. Okay, recruiters now thinking, well, tick one of the 5 boxes that I'm looking for, and then you work your way through the rest. Obviously, if you haven't got that skill, you can't do it, and you might want to put some skill on there, or skill experience that you feel is comparable. So an example might be, must have somebody who is Prince 2 qualified, and you might turn out that you're not Prince 2 qualified, but you have got managing successful programs. So you would put on something that was comparable or related. You might have a certain accountancy qualification, they might have asked for another one, but that's the sort of feel. The idea is essentially that profile area allows you something that you can tweak quickly, so you can react to these different job scenarios without having to rework all of your CV. It's kind of more just bringing to the fore the experience that is elsewhere in your CV, but bringing to the fore for the attention of the audience that you're submitting the CV for.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like you're saying that the most important element of a CV is really the content, providing it's tailor-made to the employer and is relevant wherever it can be. You also touched on earlier that not many people include the hobbies and interests section of their CV anymore, and that's really quite an important way of humanising yourself in a CV. Arguably, you could say that it's a way of standing out against other potential competitors for a job. So would you say that there are many other ways that you can make your CV stand out from the others?
Yeah, I think it does humanise you. There's actually, I'll tell you why I think it's really important as well. I think it's really important for people who are entering the job market for the first time, or very early in their career, because when you think of a school leaver or even a graduate, for example, and they may have experience that is in the dog and duck, or they may have worked in Iceland or any of those things, which is great. That showing you've had and committed to a job. It doesn't matter. They shouldn't think, oh well, it's not, I was only a shelf stacker. It's not about that. It's about showing that you held down an employed job for a period of time. But where they, for whatever reason, either their studies or whatever, they haven't really done that, then those interests and what they do can really stand out. So, for example, if you have somebody that has achieved very well in a sporting field, it might be that they ended up playing at a high level, football or table tennis or whatever. Equally, someone I mentioned earlier, someone who's completed the gold level of the Duke of Edinburgh Award, or someone who's achieved a high level of a martial arts, or someone who's been a scout leader, anything like that someone has sustained and committed to over a period of time speaks to what an employer would want. Everybody knows that to get a black belt in karate isn't an overnight thing. It may have taken someone 5, 6, 7, 10 years. Everybody knows that you don't become a top sports person by, not by lacking commitment and drive. And you don't get, again, you don't get a Duke of Edinburgh Award for going on a 2-day course. So all of these things attest to somebody being able to commit to something that they're passionate about and stay the duration. And when you haven't got that work experience to fall back on, those things can be really, they can almost do the same job. And I mean, I remember once in my very early recruitment career, and I was speaking to a lady who, when I looked down, she was customer service, individual customer service advisor for a bank, actually. But I'll never forget the lady. I can still remember her name, but I wasn't. It was probably about 24 years ago. But when I read through her CV and got to the interests, it turns out that she had competed in the Commonwealth Games, and the list of accolades at British, regional, British and international athletics was hugely impressive. And it turned out this lady, was starting to look to move her career forward, because prior to that she'd sacrificed her career, but her employer had very kindly allowed her to have that time off to compete. And as her athletics career was coming to an end, she was keen to sort of move her work career forward. But I will never forget how impressive it was to see that. And that someone who can achieve that has a lot to bring in many ways. I think that is another dimension of where particularly for those that haven't got 10 years work experience under their belt, that they can really sell themselves, if I dare use the term, sell yourself in that in hobbies and interests area.
That's brilliant. I can't say that I would forget an application from a professional athlete in a hurry either. You said earlier that you wanted to go over submitting your CV to an agency and how you can tailor it for them. So would you like to go over that now?
Yeah, and I think, one thing about the CV that everybody kind of needs to remember and bear in mind is that the danger is that you think your CV is selling you. Of course it is. But when I keep mentioning relevance to the audience, there's no point selling X if the audience is looking for Y, if you know what I mean. So kind of to some extent saying, well, I'm brilliant at this, I'm brilliant at football, is only good if the person you're speaking to is looking for a footballer. If they're looking for a rugby player, it doesn't really do you any favours, which is why you need to be relevant. But also I think it is important to understand the role of agencies as well. So one of the things that I've heard many, many times over the years is, the agency I work with are no good, they never get back to me. And all of these things might be true. Agencies, like everywhere else, have some good and bad recruiters. They have some better or could be improved practices and services. But I think it is really important to recognise that agencies are there to find the talent for the clients that pay them. So in many ways, I've always thought it's often forgotten that in most instances, it's an absolutely free service for the candidate. So the client pays the recruiter to find good candidates. And that's not to say it would be in any recruiter's interest not to give candidates a very good service, because if they're not right for this particular job, they might still be right for another job, and also they'll speak to other people for various other reasons. But it is important to look at their role, because if you were working from an agency that, if you're an entry level or in the early part of your career and you're submitting your CV through job portals, whether it be Reed or Indeed or whatever, and they're going to an advert that has been posted by an agency, then that recruiter is probably focused entirely on finding exactly what he needs to send to that client to fill the job to earn his commission. So he probably is going to be quite brutal, he or she is going to be quite brutal in terms of ticking off the 5 boxes or whatever that the client said they need, going back to the relevance of highlighting these. But you can also expect that if you work in a sector, for example, where there's very high volume of applicants and you haven't taken the time to try and grab their attention, then you probably won't get a call back because they just don't have the time. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's what it is. When you go about engaging with the agency a different way, which is trying to speak to an individual and explain to them that, you're not you're not applying for this particular job, but you want to have a conversation with them generally about how you can help or how they can help you, then you can enter into more of a relationship with the agency. So they're now thinking about multiple jobs that you might be applicable for, and now they've had a conversation where you've had that opportunity to bring your experience to life and talk about what sort of things, might be relevant, your geographic limitations, your salary limitations, and now your kind of better consultant is now thinking about you potentially for all the roles that come through their desk that might be relevant to them. Now, this may reflect some experience of the level of experience of the agency and also what sort of sector they work in. So you might find, for example, if they work in a very high turnover, temporary, industrial, white, blue-collar setting, that they're not interested in having a chat with you, because what they do is they just find X's and they put X's in front of their boss and they keep doing it. And I suspect, if you really want to be serious about your career, those places, those suppliers, agencies, whatever you want to call them, they have their place, which is, send your CV if you see an applicant or a job you're interested in, but kind of don't expect to hear back unless they're interested. The next level is obviously those that do want to engage in your conversation with you, understand what you're looking for, want to work in partnership with you. Now, you still might get, they might not be in touch every week. They probably say they will, but they might not be because they get distracted. But you more likely still to be on their radar, and you can take a little bit of ownership by not necessarily hounding them, but maybe fortnightly or whatever, touching base and saying, hi, Mr. Recruiter, can you remember we spoke about a fortnight ago? I just want to remind you my circumstances are still the same. And then as your career progresses, you can start to move up into what is an entirely different sort of level of consultant, where you start to get into the realms of, exec search or senior level appointments. And 9 times out of 10, they are really happy to engage even without a job spec in front of them, because the best ones are always looking to make relationships with talent in the market. And, life is changing for recruiters now, because certainly right now, applications are lower than ever post-Brexit, post-COVID, the great resignation, whatever you want to call it. So they really do need to engage with talent, even when, that talent might not be exactly what they have a job for right now, but their relationship is changing. But you need to be speaking to that more, I hate to use the word professional, because I'm not meaning to imply the others aren't, but you need to be speaking to the agencies that are working in that space and want to work in partnership with the candidates they represent. And there are some agents out there that you just have to recognise are posting jobs and trying to fill jobs. And your approach to the market, and when you go back to what we said about networking and all that sort of stuff, then your approach to the market to look for work is a blended approach across all of those platforms. So I apply to these jobs every day, blah, blah, blah. I kind of know I might not hear back, but I think I'm a good match for them. The caveat I would say is, please do be a good match. You don't expect to hear back if you'd have applied to be an astronaut and you're not an astronaut. But, if you've applied for genuine roles, you might hear back, but you kind of mentally say to yourself, I probably won't hear from them unless they're interested. Then there's the next tier that you say, right, well, I want to have some conversations. I don't want to speak to every agency, but I want to, do a bit of research. I want to find the 3 or 4 good agencies that either work in my specific industry or they've got a good brand reputation in the marketplace. And then you have a different type of conversation. And if you're at the right level of seniority, then that's when you can say, well, actually, I'm going to pick 1 or 2 executive partners that are going to go away and actually speak to some people on my behalf, where they know there might be movement in that organisation, but the job hasn't come out yet. Because you've got to remember, in the job market, there's a huge amount of jobs never see an agency, never come to an agency or even see the light of day, because they're either filled internally or they're conceptual in nature, that the manager, is maybe thinking about a change to his department, but he hasn't formally done it yet. And that's where those better relationships with agencies, they'll know their markets, they'll know which of their organisations are about to go through a relocation or a change that might prove to be relevant for you. So, I think if you just perhaps want to have a better experience of agencies, you just perhaps need to recognise which of those level of agencies / consultants you're speaking to, and then you get less frustrated because you're not hearing back all the time.
Amazing, thank you. Just a final question from me on the CV section. Are there any serious do's or don'ts for when building your CV?
The do's are, as I mentioned, which is, be concise, be specific, be quantifiable and qualifiable where you can. The don'ts, I think, yes, you can be a little bit looser in maybe your hobbies area, but don't try and bring comedy into your CV. Jokes might be, funny at home, but they don't necessarily translate to a CV. One of which I will cover off, and I'm going to be a bit on the fence here, is pictures. So I don't like pictures on CVs. I think with the best will in the world, it does allow people to make assumptions about you rightly or wrongly based on what you look like, which I certainly think people shouldn't be doing. But also, culturally, there's a number of countries in the world where I think they're very much told that a picture is part of your CV. But I'm not really sure culturally and historically in Britain that we like CVs with pictures on. Am I categorically calling it a don't? Maybe not, but I just think it allows people, if you look at a world where we're trying to move away from bias and unconscious bias and ageism and promote diversity and inclusion and all of those things, I'm not really sure there's a place for your picture in there that will allow, rightly or wrongly, people to make those assumptions about you. So for me, it's don't. There might be many other people view it very differently. I think the other thing is, and this is difficult, and this is an area I think people do need to get better, is don't ramble. A lot of people, again, there's an area of subjectivity here. I'm a big fan of short paragraphs with bullet points. Some other people, I think it becomes very difficult if people write their CVs in paragraph after paragraph after paragraph with no kind of difference in emphasis, no use of bullet points, no use of specific things. It just becomes like reading a novel. And I think most human beings, the best will in the world, switch off after a couple of paragraphs of reading what somebody else thinks is really important. So that's about it, really. I think, so if I was ready to bullet point that, I think do's, be concise, be specific, be quantifiable and qualifiable, most of all be relevant. Don't try not to go above 4 pages. Don't include your picture, and use bullet points to break up paragraphs and emphasize key skills and experience. The jury is out on the picture one. I might get lynched for that. I might feel very differently if I look like Brad Pitt, but as I don't, I have a different view.
Well, you always look like Brad Pitt in my eyes, Stephen. We touched on standing out of the crowd with your CV, and this can be a huge challenge when you're going up for a sought-after position. But are there other ways, Stephen, of standing out of the crowd beyond your CV?
This is increasingly difficult. I think the way technology plays a role in recruitment now and how everything has become hugely internet driven, it is increasingly difficult to stand out from the crowd. So at the very start of my career, I worked in a traditional high street branch for a high street agency, and how you interacted with the recruitment consultant on that desk, if you like, sat there, really mattered. So little things like being punctual for the appointment, being well presented, being organised, bringing the paperwork they'd asked you to bring, all of those things spoke to you being organised and efficient. And that's now increasingly difficult to do because the high street role of agency is diminishing, or as your career experience expands, they play less of a role for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. So you're now in a situation where your first point of contact is through a system that is in many ways designed to block you having any further contact. So through an agency, I would definitely say you can bring it to your attention by even adding a supplement or a note. So say if you're sending in by email, it might just be putting a note on there to say, I appreciate you might not have the time to come back to me if I'm not an ideal match for this role, but I would really welcome an opportunity to have a conversation about other opportunities that you may see in the future. So kind of recognising and preempting that. I recognise how busy you are. I recognise you might not be able to come back to me, but I am keen to have a chat. And you might even want to, after a week or 10 days or so, follow that up with a polite call. Not a haranguing call, because generally trying to somehow berate the recruiter for not getting back to you is usually not a very good long-term strategy for a relationship with that recruiter. But empathising with them and trying to get that conversation is probably something you can do. I think if you're applying directly to a company, it gets even trickier now, because I think many of the processes you go through where the company is involved directly, then their ATS system, for want of a better word, will be very keen to send you an automated message to say, thank you for your interest in us, and due to the high number of applicants, we will come back to you if we're interested. And they're almost specifically designed to prevent you doing anything that can stand out. So I think in terms of standing out at the application stage, the best thing you can do is focus on that relevance. And sorry to go back to it, but that relevance of CV is the key thing to get you that chance. Now, when you get interviews, that's a kind of different kettle of fish, and there are some things you can do to stand out. They're a bit cliche, they're a bit old hat, but they still work. Punctuality is absolutely key. If you get a chance to be in front of anybody, then I think the old adage is if you're not 10 minutes early, you're late. But you should definitely be on time. And I know we all rely on, whether it be public transport or the joys of the motorway, they can always make you late. But always, if you do find that you're running late, so first of all, make sure you build in time to try and minimise the risk of you being late. But ultimately, if you find yourself and you are going to be late, take the time to give them a call. People will be forgiven if you give them a heads up that you're going to be late. Because everybody recognises that everybody's late once or twice in their life. But if you just don't tell anybody and then don't arrive for a call, or don't arrive, which a Teams call now, probably more likely than a face-to-face, you've probably got 3 or 4 minutes for people to be sat on that Teams call. And if you log on 10 minutes late without alerting them, I wouldn't be expecting anybody to be on that call still. I think people still remember people, in terms of how they behave and their attitude, both to, even reception staff, if you're lucky to go face to face, or your basic levels of courtesy and all of those things are still really important when you have face to face. Remember to thank people for their time afterwards. And yeah, there's still some of the old school things still hold. They've changed into a Teams environment rather than face to face, but they still hold. If you find yourself with a call with an agency or an employer, make sure that you put yourself in the best possible position so you can be attentive for that call. Now, it has become the new norm that I think anybody at any level might at least once in a Teams call apologise because their dog's gone nuts or the Amazon man's arriving. So the world has become a little bit more informal, but try to make sure you're somewhere where you can connect and it's relatively quiet where you are, or if there's going to be a disruption, make an apology for that disruption in advance. These things are still important because somebody is taking their time to speak to you, so you need to recognise that, I think.
Amazing, thank you. So now more than ever, it's increasingly difficult to stand out, at least in the early stages. Perhaps in an interview you can make more of an effort. That being said, has anyone ever done something that made them stand out to you during your time looking at CVs or during an interview?
It's a tricky one because I've kind of met a lot of people over the years, being a recruiter. But I know if I speak more generally, it is still, I think, probably a huge factor that people don't prepare enough. So, people either feel like they can perhaps just wing it when they get to the meeting, or they think they've prepared, but they haven't. But if you have a candidate who you speak to, and I'll tell you, actually, no, I will give you an example. So I was recently speaking to a candidate, and we're looking for them for this particular project we've got, and they are actually based in a different country at the moment, potentially coming over to do some work. And when I asked them what their salary expectation was, they went out to explain that they'd actually researched comparable salaries for their level of experience and their level of role, and then went on to explain to me based on that the kind of minimum that they'd be looking for. Now, the fact they'd gone out and done that research for what that salary might equate to in a different country is just an example of how preparation can work. So, what you'll often see is, inevitably the interviewer will ask you at some point, what do you know anything about us? And if your stock answer to that is, well, I had a quick look at your CV, a quick look at your internet or your website, but no, not generally, then that kind of says to me as the interviewer, well, so you knew in advance you were coming to meet me, but really you haven't gone even remotely out your way to look at anything about our organisation. Whereas if someone was to turn around and say, yes, I've explored your website in detail, I can see that obviously you work significantly across the world, and actually you have 4 main divisions in the UK, and if I can understand things correctly, I'll be interviewing for this division, which is based here and does this. Then, all of a sudden you're thinking somebody has taken a bit of time to come, likewise, when someone gets to the end, I'm thinking of more examples now. When you get to the end and somebody says, have you got any questions? It is possible that in the interview they've answered every question, but it's really good if you happen to prepare and bring a few with them. And even if they do then answer all those by saying something like, well, actually, I specifically wanted to ask about your benefits package, and I specifically wanted to ask about promotion opportunities, but actually you've covered both those in the interview, you're demonstrating again that you came prepared to have a meaningful conversation about the opportunity. And it is important that interviewees take an active role in that interviewing process. It is a two-way street. It's a two-way interaction. And yes, I know the individual may either, in personal circumstances might desperately want that job, but you still should take an active role in the interview, as if to say, well, I'm not saying you flip the other way and you look, so laid back and arrogant that, you'd be doing me a favour by employing me. But there's certainly a middle ground of, actually, I'm seriously here because I want to find out if this is the right job for me, as well as if I'm the right person for you. And that always impresses, that someone's taken that time. So I suppose to summarise, prepare. I know it's an old adage. I won't do the cliche about fail to prepare and prepare to fail and all that, but showing that you've taken the time and interest and done some research about the organisation, about the role, potentially looking up the individual on LinkedIn, finding out a little bit about them, be on time, be well presented. Now, well presented doesn't mean, I don't believe in the old adage now that you can't have tattoos and all of that sort of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. But, there's still a certain level of looking prepared and presenting yourself well. And then, towards the end of the interview, take part in the interview, ask questions, and then thank people for their time. And these little touches do make a difference, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you. Is there anything you yourself have done to stand out?
Well, I think, very early in my career, and, I don't know if this is exactly the thing, but I was put in a temporary job, and it turned out that it was a Monday. This is my first work experience post-uni, actually, and I was put in a temporary job, and it turned out that instead of it being Monday to Friday, it was Monday and Friday, which obviously was no good to me. So the lady phoned me up, a lovely lady, actually, I still remember her name, Pat Alvey, and she phoned me up and told me, and I'd said, well, that's no good to me, so I stopped the job. But I actually felt that I'd been a bit rude. I hadn't meant to be, but my accent was still quite strong at the time. So I went in and I actually apologised to Pat, and I said, Pat, I didn't mean to be rude, but obviously working 2 days a week, it doesn't really work for me. So we then had a conversation, and that conversation led to her finding me another job, and ultimately it led to me starting to work for that organisation in my first ever recruitment job. So, I'm not saying that what I did was anything special, but I'm saying for recruiters particularly, having candidates that recognise what their job is and the challenges they face, and being polite and courteous stands out a long way with recruiters. With clients, I think I'm not always sure what the response will be, but if it's directly with an employer, it might be more difficult for the reasons I mentioned, but I don't think there's anything wrong, and it also does make you stand out if after you find that you have been unsuccessful for a job, is to go back to ask for feedback so that you can improve on things, and also again use that as an opportunity to say, can we have a wider conversation about, how we may be able to work together, how we may be able to help me going forward. So again, it's just those little things, but certainly when dealing with an agency, I think it is a recognition that, recruitment is a tough job. That's not to say other jobs aren't, but recognising the strains and stresses that a recruiter's under, that sort of level of courtesy can really engage them in terms of trying to be partners on how to look for you. The only other thing I think that I've personally done is when I was going into a different role, I hadn't done that sort of role before. I'd done something related, but not that sort of role. I kind of said to the manager, one of the things that they highlighted was I hadn't worked in that specific area before. And I did have the luxury of actually relocating, so I could afford to do this. I'm not so sure it's a wise strategy if you're currently in work, but I turned around with them and said, well, give me a go, because I believe I can do this. And if it doesn't work out after 6 months, then you can let me go. And so that sort of sharing of the risk, I think, helped me out in that instance. Now, I'm not saying you might be as cavalier as that, but it might be recognising, for example, that if you want to change your career direction into something that you haven't done 100%, then, not maybe moving for a parity of salary, or even in some cases, if you can afford a slight drop, then that's how to transition your CV from your experience, from one area to another. But again, that might be a different conversation. Likewise, I think for people entering the marketplace for the first time, again, depend on the job and depend on the individual circumstances, offering to volunteer. I did some work where it was actually a friend of a friend, and he'd finished a course on, I think it was some sort of digital graphic design course in the town we were living in. There aren't the huge amount of media agencies that London had, but he didn't want to go to London, and this alludes to network, I suppose, as well. So his sister actually worked for me. She mentioned him, and I connected him with somebody who I knew who ran a digital agency, and that conversation started off with him volunteering a couple of days a week to build up his portfolio to the point where he'd saved up enough money to go to London, and ultimately ended up with him working for 2 weeks voluntary and then securing a permanent job with them. Well, I suppose that's an example of how networking can work as well as volunteering can work if you're in a highly competitive candidate marketplace.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. If we have successfully pieced together all the advice you've given us, Stephen, then we should have a strong network of connections, a good-looking and effective CV, and we're standing out of the crowd. This should lead us to an interview. When you get that interview, do you have any practices or tips before that interview to settle any nerves?
Interviewing, I suppose, in a fear level is tantamount to public speaking. And I think one thing that is very important, again, is that preparation. So I know there's a belief probably that, I've no idea what they're going to ask me. And you might even hear the term competency-based interview. You're going to attend a competency-based interview. So usually the job description will tell you the competencies, or if you're working through an agency, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying to the agencies, if it's going to be a competency-based interview, can you find out from them what the competencies are? So then between the job description and the competencies, which are usually the softer skills, teamwork, for example, you can start to get a feel for how the interview might go. You can't necessarily adapt straight away for what their style will be, whether it'll be, a Dragon's Den style interrogative interview, or whether it'll be much more informal interview. But what you can do is start to understand, well, I understand what the job is, and I understand the top 4 or 5 job will do. And I also, from the job description, understand the key competencies they're looking for. So in the same as everything, you can prepare for that. Now, that's not to say there might always be, a curveball, or there might be something else, but you generally know that their questions, one way or another, are going to be about those first 5 or 6 things that the job description outlines. And at some point, they're probably going to cover, can you give me examples of, and then go through what the competencies are. So you can practice and mentally rehearse those, and mentally rehearsing them inevitably leads to a better performance on the day. So you could, for example, if you were not so senior and you were entering the marketplace for the first time, try and find an adult or someone in a position of authority, or even if not, then a friend who you can go through a mock interview scenario with, and, get used to that idea. They can almost even ask them to be a little bit awkward, be a little bit obtuse, ask them to push you a little bit further. And, going through those things, practicing 1, 2, 3, 4 times, you will inevitably get better at your answers. If for more experienced people, then certainly, even then, you might find someone who's had a really solid career with one employer, for example, and then just finds through redundancy or changing location that this is the first time they've attended an interview in X number of years. It could be equally nerve-wracking for them, regardless of their perceived experience and the amount of times they might have done this. And again, even at that level, rehearse and practice. Understand that what they'd be looking for you to do is answer the question concisely. If you don't understand the question, there's absolutely nothing wrong, and it's not a sign of weakness, and it certainly shouldn't be held against you to turn around to the interviewer and say, sorry, I don't really understand what you're asking me. Is there any chance you can clarify the question, or repeat the question if you didn't quite get it? And they should do that absolutely happily. Likewise, in terms of just trying to keep yourself under control, particularly if you do find this sort of interview, public speaking type thing very nerve-wracking, then answer the question and then close that down by saying, has that answered the question, or would you like me to go into more detail? Because there's nothing worse, and it's very easily done if people are nervous, is that they, will just talk and talk and talk after being asked a question, and they might have answered the question relatively quickly, but you don't need to answer every question with a 20-minute response. So again, just trying to think, can I be concise while still making sure I've answered all the points the individual wants to? And that, again, to some extent comes down to rehearsal. A particular technique I always like to adopt, or have adopted in the past, is I always view the question from a larger environment to specifically what I did. So one of the things people often do is answer with, we have done this or we have done that. And obviously the client wants to know that, but they also particularly want to know what you've done. So you may, for example, if you're talking about a project, so it may be that you turn around and say, as part of the project team, we implemented a new recruitment customer relationship management tool. We had multiple work streams and we delivered it on time within budget. My specific role as part of that project team was to manage the transition of the data from the old system to the new system, and I worked with a small project team that I managed to deliver that on time. So again, you've gone from a kind of, this is what we did in a macro sense, down to a micro of what I did. And that holds true really with competency-based questions. So if somebody says, for example, Can you give me an example of where you've demonstrated teamwork? And you might turn around and say, within our organisation, we work on multiple projects simultaneously, and we are often members of different teams to deliver that. One of the biggest projects we delivered is, and I would go on to say, it's a customer relationship management tool again. My specific role in that was actually pull together and manage a small team of individuals that are responsible for transferring the work. And this involved managing individuals who were on multiple locations, working different hours across different time zones to make sure the work was delivered. So that's just, again, an example of how you would adopt an overarching view and then a specific as to what I did. So that kind of speaking in the first person about what you specifically did is something definitely to bear in mind.
Fantastic, thank you. Before you've interviewed anyone, are there qualities you are hoping to see? What are the first things that you notice about a candidate?
Say if I imagine this scenario in an old school environment where someone's attended the office, if you like, and maybe it'll be the future again, who knows. If somebody had arrived 10, 15 minutes early, and when I went to collect them from the waiting room or the meeting room or wherever they were there, that would be the first thing you would notice. Again, body language is important, but not everybody oozes confidence, not everybody swaggers into the room, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate if everybody did. I mean, you may, for example, expect a sales guy to do it, but would you necessarily expect perhaps, I don't know, an auditor or a finance business partner to come in with the same swagger? So that confidence certainly needs to be there, but it doesn't need to be over the top. But yes, approaching somebody with a welcoming smile, a nice handshake, not a wrist breaker, but a good firm handshake, a warm greeting, thank you for your time, or hi Jeff, it's really nice to meet you, thanks for taking the time today. Those sort of things do inevitably make people relax more, and oddly enough, the more nervous the candidate looks, then almost in many ways the harder the interview becomes, because you can almost feel like you to some extent want to take it easy on that candidate because they're clearly very, very nervous. So tricks that candidates can learn to try and hide their nerves is just working on many of the way you see politicians that will make sure their hands are clasped in front of them when they're delivering awkward messages, or they'll make sure that they hold their fingers and thumbs together as they point forward, and politicians have been coached for many years as to hide micro behaviors in their hands and body language. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all need to become body language experts, but it is worth being aware of sitting up straight, for example. If you do fidget with your hands, then put your hands somewhere that will help you stop fidgeting. That might just be resting them on your knees. It might be placing them firmly together. But I know, for example, my daughter was going for an interview just for one of her colleges, and she has she wrings her hands together. So, I've kind of explained to her to just try and make sure that she might just keep one hand on her ring, and turning the ring in her finger, for example, might replace the general fidgeting of her hands. So it's kind of just thinking, well, how can I, what can I do that might just stop me moving around? Sit firmly in the chair, get comfortable, try not to move around. Once you've adopted a comfortable position, put your hands somewhere where they're not going to be, overly fidgety, if that's something that you do. Likewise, if you find that you're a bit more theatrical in nature and your arms fly all over as you're talking, then gesticulating with your arms is absolutely fine. But just be aware if you do it too much and try and minimize those sort of things. But no, generally speaking, it's about the warmth of an individual. People do like confident people, and being warm and friendly goes a long way upon that first interaction. It's an old adage really, but a really wide smile and looking like you're happy to meet somebody is probably about the most important thing after being on time, I think.
Great, thanks. So we've all felt the sting of not getting a job that we felt we were certainly qualified for. Do people get rejected in this instance because they simply didn't come off too friendly or persuasive enough in the interview? Ultimately, what affects yours or others' decision for who gets the job?
I mean, this is very tricky. I still think that how people interact with people plays a key role in whether they secure the role or not. I think there's a lot of work being done in the sector to minimise things like unconscious bias that we know we all have, but we're not there yet. And I think how you're perceived, unfortunately, is still really important. And people who are perceived as warm, open, friendly, perhaps more relaxed and more confident, I would bet probably perform better or are more likely to be offered the job than someone who was clearly very nervous or clearly unprepared. Now that seems very harsh on people who don't find being confident naturally, and there's a caveat here, I suppose, that it's probably not that what I've just said probably isn't true in a case where there's a high level of technical capability to a role. You might just find that you've been pipped to the post by someone who either had a broader range of technical skills or one specific skill in more depth, and only really by requesting feedback can you find out, if you've gone, for example, I can't think of one, but there might be an example where an IT programmer, for example, there's another IT programmer that just is better at that particular software, or has been using it longer, or has been using it in an industry sector that's exactly the same as this one where another candidate's used it in a different sector. So everything I've said about confidence doesn't really apply maybe in those highly technical roles, but where it's less technical, so say general office administrative work or customer service type work, then these things really do stand out. So while it would seem unfair perhaps on people who are a little more reserved, then I think, the idea is that that's something that they would really be consciously trying to work on. And trying to improve in terms of more time rehearsing interviews, putting yourself in situations where you can run through dry runs or rehearse. I think employers are definitely trying to get better to take away decisions that would unfairly give people an advantage over the job. And ironically, when I mentioned that it's very difficult to have direct conversations with companies directly now, then most people who've applied for a job via a company will see that their portal is almost designed to do that. And I think the idea is that the CV presented to the hiring manager doesn't have unconscious bias and all of those things in. But right now, it's still very prevalent in what we do, and how you present yourself is important, and should the right time and preparation should be given, particularly if you're going for a job that you think, I really want to get this job. Should you find it hasn't gone the way you wanted and you weren't successful, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with asking for feedback. I think there's an added point as well that, while you're not right for that job, I think asking for feedback will also show the particular hiring company or whatever that you're committed and serious about applying for their role. So there's always the chance it might lead to something else, but trying to follow up with that conversation and drop it again through a polite message to the talent acquisition team or the recruiter to say, look, appreciate I didn't get the job, fully understand, is there any chance that I could just have some feedback that'll help me improve on my performance going forward when I apply for similar roles? But right now there shouldn't really be any fundamental decision for who gets the role, other than that performance at the interview and their technical ability to do the role, really.
Amazing, thank you. Final question from me then. You've already covered the do's for interviews and then some. Are there any major don'ts though?
Well, I think, again, I'm speaking of a certain age and maybe things are slightly different, but I always feel it's better to approach an interview fairly formal initially. You never really know the audience or the style of the audience that are going to interview you, and it's very difficult to move from informal to formal, whereas it's much easier to move from formal to informal. So I would always work on the basis that you're going to have quite a formal interview approach. It isn't a wise strategy to assume a a super relaxed position and open with anecdotes about, how your football team did at the weekend, until you've established that that's the sort of audience you're involved in. So my don't would be, don't be late, don't turn up, super informal. And also, I think there's a fine line between the confidence as well. I think there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with confidence at all. And in certain roles, there might even not be anything wrong with a little bit of arrogance. But there's a very fine line between that and, making an organisation unless you've got a skill set that absolutely backs it up. But, to sit there and almost adopt an attitude of, well, you tell me why I should come and work for your company, may work in rare situations like Dragon's Den, for example, but probably wouldn't be the best strategy for most interviews. In terms of other don'ts, I would say there's nothing wrong at the end of the interview asking when you might hear, but it certainly wouldn't be appropriate probably to chase up directly with the client. It's certainly like in terms of a ridiculous short notice period, as in, email them when you get home. It certainly wouldn't be appropriate to go back to the client for feedback if you're being represented by an agency. You should go back to the agency that represented you, and you by all means contact them to say, could you just let Anne know that I thoroughly enjoyed the interview. I'd like you to thank her for her time. I look forward to hearing due course. There's nothing wrong with that. But, chasing up and saying, when will I hear, have I got the job, or chasing up multiple times in a short period of time probably, won't help your case. Don'ts in interviews, I suppose the other thing is, it never really looks good if you sit there and just absolutely speak incredibly negatively about your current employer. You may be unhappy for a number of reasons in your current employer, and there's nothing wrong with politely outlining some of your disgruntlements, but to sit and, just highly criticize your previous employers or bosses or that sort of stuff really doesn't really give the right impression, if you know what I mean. You sort of, there's a way to discuss those things, but not necessarily turn it into just a sort of victimization of other people. And that's about it, really. I suppose the only other don't I can think about is kind of the similar thing, really. What will put somebody off is if every reason you left, every role you'd ever had was always somebody else's fault or reason, because ultimately it sounds like you'd ultimately be the common denominator in that scenario. So if you are moving to a new role, or you've been interviewed because you are a bit disgruntled where you are, probably how you package that is without being dishonest, of course, but at the same time, how you packaging it tactfully will probably work better for you than saying, my current bosses are a bunch of whatever, and I'm looking because I can't stand working there a minute longer. But again, it's just a sort of packaging presentation thing, really.
Brilliant, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
The key things I would say through it all is really take it seriously, and not just for each job you go on. Or some people might only find themselves looking for jobs once or twice in their career if they're really lucky, and that's fine, and those people are indeed very lucky. But I think the new norm is that if somebody's been in a job, but most people I think move somewhere between 2 and 3 years for various reasons. But I think if I had my time again and I was starting out again, then I'd pay a lot more attention to how seriously I took ownership of my career from start to finish. We're going right back from the beginning of this conversation about really understanding the role of my personal brand and network and how that plays in starting your career and developing your career, right through to each job I went for, really taking the time to prepare that application. I think we can all look back on things where we saw something and we popped the CV through because it was quick, and looking back you think, well, if I'd have just maybe just taken overnight to spend a little bit more time, maybe I would have been called for that interview when I wasn't. At the interview, the same as everything to do with public speaking, if it isn't something you're really comfortable with, then practice. take the time to understand and get feedback from somebody on dummy runs, somebody who will feedback honestly, someone who might turn around to you and say, well, actually, it was very difficult to concentrate because you were looking all over the room, or someone might turn around and say, I was getting put off because, you were fidgeting with your trouser leg all the time. So, but if you get that feedback and you're aware of that feedback, then you can start to, look into tools that prevent you doing those things. And you only really can get that by feedback, because most of these behaviours, you don't even know you're doing them, because by their very nature, they're sort of, they're behaviours we're not aware of. So again, that practice, and then when you've got the interview, prepare, treat the organisation with the respect it deserves, that have taken the time to see you. I'm not saying be overly subservient, be absolutely aware of what you're bringing to the table and be confident in that. And the interview should be a two-way street. But, prepare, learn a little bit about the organisation, about the individuals who are interviewing you, about, what they do for a living, what the business is about, and then prepare questions towards the end of that. Prepare to how you're going to answer the questions. You might not get every question they're going to ask you, but if you feel comfortable answering 80% of the questions, then you can address the 10-20% that have come at you from nowhere. Thank them for their time. Be sensible about how you seek feedback, both in terms of timescales of knowing the outcome of the interview, but also then following up to that in terms of trying to get feedback if you weren't successful, and feed that feedback into your learning for the next time round. But always remember that sometimes if you didn't get the job, without sounding too cliched, it genuinely might not have been the right job. Or sometimes, as is the way these days, you might have just been pipped to the post by someone who was either just a bit better on the day, or might just have a little bit more experience. But it shouldn't put you off continuing through the process. But my top tip would be take your career seriously and give each of the stages the sort of time they deserve, really.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview with me, Stephen.
No problem, Joe. It was a pleasure to talk, and thanks for inviting me.
I know I certainly learned a lot from it, and I'm sure our audience can say the same. I hope that you'll join us on the podcast again sometime. And thank you, audience, for listening to this full and uncut interview. We hope you enjoyed. And if you did, please leave a rating or a comment. If you'd like to leave feedback or suggest episode ideas, then email connectorpods@gmail.com. See you next time.